The cameras were rolling, but nobody was ready. Jimmy Fallon's mouth had just formed a single word, a word so ordinary, so unremarkable, that producers would later say there was no way to predict what happened next. Robert De Niro, the man who had spent 5 decades mastering the art of controlled emotion, suddenly gripped the armrests of his chair. His knuckles went white. His jaw tightened. And then, in front of 200 stunned audience members and millions watching at home, he stood up. The studio fell into a silence so complete you could hear the hum of the stage lights. Jimmy's hand, still raised mid-gesture from his joke, froze in the air. The roots stopped moving. Camera operators held their breath. Because this wasn't in the script. This wasn't planned. And nobody, not the producers in the control room, not the audience, not even Jimmy himself, knew what was about to happen. But to understand how a single word could stop one of the most controlled men in Hollywood, we have to go back. Back to 3 hours earlier, when Robert De Niro walked into Studio 6B with something heavy on his mind. It was a Tuesday night in October, and The Tonight Show was gearing up for what seemed like a standard episode. Robert De Niro was scheduled to promote his latest film, a crime thriller that had him playing an aging detective haunted by an unsolved case. The pre-interview had gone smoothly. De Niro was professional, focused, maybe a bit quieter than usual, but that was De Niro. He wasn't known for small talk. Jimmy Fallon, on the other hand, was in his element. Backstage, he was running through his monologue jokes, fist-bumping crew members, checking in with the roots. This was his ritual, his way of keeping the energy light before the show went live. But when he passed De Niro's dressing room, something made him stop. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, De Niro sat alone on a leather couch, staring at his phone. His thumb scrolled slowly, mechanically, through what looked like old photographs. Jimmy didn't knock. He just watched for a moment, sensing something he couldn't name. Then De Niro looked up, their eyes met, and the actor gave a small nod. Jimmy nodded back and kept walking. He didn't know it then, but that moment would change everything. The show started like it always does. Monologue. Laughs. Sketches. The audience was hot, the energy was electric, and Jimmy was firing on all cylinders. By the time Robert De Niro was introduced, the crowd erupted in applause. This was a legend. A man who had given the world Travis Bickle, Jake LaMotta, Vito Corleone. When he walked out onto that stage, people stood. De Niro shook Jimmy's hand, settled into the guest chair, and the interview began. They talked about the new film. They talked about method acting. Jimmy showed a clip. The audience laughed at a behind-the-scenes story about De Niro refusing to break character even during lunch breaks. Everything was going exactly as planned. And then Jimmy, trying to transition into a lighter segment, said something he'd said 1,000 times before on the show. It was meant to be a joke, a simple setup for a funny bit about De Niro's legendary intensity. He leaned forward with that trademark Fallon grin and said, "You know, Bob, people always say you're so serious, so focused, but I heard backstage that you've actually got a reputation for being the nicest guy on set. Especially to the crew. One PA told me you always remember everyone's name. Like always. Even people you've only met once." De Niro smiled, a little embarrassed, and shrugged. "I try." "But why?" Jimmy asked, leaning in. "What makes you do that? I mean, you're Robert De Niro. You could show up, do your thing, and leave. But you don't. You stay. You talk to people. You remember their names, their birthdays, their kids' names. Why does that matter so much to you?" And that's when De Niro's face changed. It was subtle at first. A flicker in his eyes. A slight tightening of his mouth. But Jimmy saw it. The audience didn't. The cameras didn't catch it right away. But Jimmy Fallon, who had spent years learning to read people across a desk, saw it. And he knew something had shifted. De Niro looked down at his hands. Then he looked back up at Jimmy, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter, heavier. "You want to know why?" Jimmy nodded, no longer joking. "Yeah. I do. De Niro took a breath. Because of a guy named Vincent. The studio went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that happens during a dramatic pause, but the kind that happens when people sense they're about to hear something real. Jimmy didn't interrupt. He just waited. Vincent was a grip. De Niro continued. Worked on Taxi Driver. 1975. I was young, full of myself, thought I knew everything. Vincent was older, maybe 60. Quiet guy. Did his job, never complained. One day, between takes, I was sitting in a corner going over my lines, and Vincent came over. Didn't say much. Just asked if I needed anything. Water, coffee, whatever. I said no. He nodded and walked away. De Niro paused. His jaw tightened again. Next day, Vincent didn't show up. Day after that either. I asked around. Found out he'd had a heart attack. Died in his sleep. The silence in the studio deepened. Even the control room had gone still. I never knew his last name. De Niro said, his voice cracking just slightly. Never asked about his family. Never asked where he was from. He was just Vincent the Grip. And then he was gone. And I realized I'd spent weeks working next to a man I never really saw. Subscribe and leave a comment. Because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Jimmy's eyes were glistening now. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The audience sat frozen, hanging on every word. So after that, De Niro said, I made a promise. I would never walk onto a set and treat people like they were invisible. I would learn their names. I would ask about their lives. Because you never know when someone's last day is going to be their last day. And I don't want to be the guy who didn't care enough to ask. The emotion in the room was palpable. People in the audience were crying. Camera operators wiped their eyes. Even the Roots, who had seen everything over the years, were visibly moved. But then something happened that nobody expected. Jimmy Fallon, who always knew how to keep a show moving, who always had the next joke ready, who prided himself on never letting the energy drop, Jimmy stopped. He looked at De Niro, then he looked at the audience, then he did something he had never done before in the history of The Tonight Show. He took off his tie. It was a small gesture, but in the language of late-night television, it was revolutionary. The tie was part of the uniform, part of the persona, part of the show. And Jimmy, without saying a word, loosened it, pulled it over his head, and set it on the desk. Bob, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I need to tell you something. De Niro looked at him, confused. There's someone here tonight, Jimmy continued. Who needs to hear what you just said? He turned to the audience. Is Michael here? Michael Rodriguez? A young man in the third row, maybe 25 years old, slowly raised his hand. His face was wet with tears. Jimmy gestured for him to come forward. The audience parted as Michael, shaking, made his way down the aisle and onto the stage. He stood there, unsure, looking between Jimmy and De Niro like he'd walked into the wrong room. Michael, Jimmy said gently, tell them why you're here tonight. Michael's voice was barely above a whisper. My dad was a stagehand. He worked on Saturday Night Live for 30 years. He passed away 3 weeks ago. The audience gasped. De Niro stood up. Not slowly. Not carefully. He stood up like a man who had just been hit with something he couldn't ignore. He walked over to Michael and put both hands on the young man's shoulders. What was his name? De Niro asked. Carlos, Michael said, his voice breaking. Carlos Rodriguez. De Niro closed his eyes. I knew Carlos. He was a good man. Michael's knees nearly buckled. You knew him? I worked with him on a film in 2010, De Niro said. He told me about you. About how proud he was that you were going to college. About how you wanted to be a writer. Michael couldn't speak. He just stood there, tears streaming down his face, as Robert De Niro, the Robert De Niro, held him steady. Your father mattered, De Niro said, his own voice cracking now. He mattered to me. He mattered to everyone who worked with him. And I'm sorry I didn't get to tell him that one more time. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. Jimmy Fallon, standing off to the side, reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. He walked over to Michael and handed it to him. This belonged to your dad, Jimmy said. The SNL crew gave it to me this morning. They said he kept it in his toolbox. They thought you should have it. Michael opened the notebook with trembling hands. Inside were dozens of notes, sketches, little observations Carlos had written over the years. Notes about lighting setups, about camera angles, about how to make a scene work better. And on the last page, in his father's handwriting, were 3 words. Make them care. Michael looked up at Jimmy, then at De Niro, then at the audience. 200 people who were all on their feet now, applauding not because they were told to, but because they couldn't not. Because they had just witnessed something that transcended entertainment. They had witnessed love. They had witnessed grief. They had witnessed 2 men, one a superstar, one a kid who'd just lost his dad, connected by the simple, profound act of remembering. Robert De Niro pulled Michael into a hug. The cameras kept rolling, but nobody was directing anymore. This wasn't a show. This was life, raw and unscripted, happening in real time. When they finally pulled apart, De Niro looked at the notebook in Michael's hands and said, Your dad was right. Make them care. That's all that matters. Jimmy, his voice barely holding together, turned to the camera. We're going to take a break, he said. But nobody moved. Not the audience. Not the crew. Not even the producers in the control room. Because everyone understood that what had just happened couldn't be interrupted. It was too big. Too real. Too important. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. After the show, something remarkable happened. Michael stayed backstage with De Niro for over an hour. They talked about Carlos, about the film they'd worked on together, about the little moments De Niro remembered, Carlos's laugh, the way he always had a roll of gaffer tape on his belt, the stories he told about growing up in the Bronx. But more than that, De Niro made Michael a promise. Anytime you need to talk, he said, handing Michael his personal number. You call me. I mean it. And he did mean it. Because 6 months later, when Michael's first short film premiered at a small festival in Brooklyn, Robert De Niro was there. Sitting in the back row. Watching a kid he barely knew chase a dream that his father never got to see come true. Jimmy Fallon never forgot that night either. He kept the tie he'd taken off, the one he'd removed in that moment of raw vulnerability, framed in his office. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder that the best moments in life aren't the ones you plan. They're the ones where you stop pretending, stop performing, and just let yourself be human. In interviews afterward, people asked Jimmy why he did it. Why he stopped the show. Why he took off the tie. Why he brought Michael onto the stage. His answer was always the same. Because Robert De Niro taught me something that night. He taught me that the only thing that really matters is making people feel seen. And Michael needed to be seen. He needed to know that his dad mattered. That his grief mattered. That he wasn't alone. The clip of that night went viral, as these things do. But it wasn't the usual kind of viral. It wasn't people sharing it for shock value or for laughs. It was people sharing it because it reminded them of someone they'd lost. Someone they'd loved. Someone whose name they wanted to say out loud one more time. And in the end, that's what Vincent the Grip had taught Robert De Niro all those years ago on the set of Taxi Driver. That names matter. That people matter. That the only legacy worth leaving is the one where people remember you cared. The Tonight Show went on, as it always does. But for everyone who was in that studio that night, for the crew, for the audience, for Michael Rodriguez, for Robert De Niro, and for Jimmy Fallon, nothing was quite the same. Because they had been reminded of something the world too often forgets, That behind every name, there's a story. Behind every story, there's a person. And behind every person, there's someone who will miss them when they're gone. Make them care. That's all that matters.